In this video, we're going to be building a Toothpick 3. Thanks to Enine for sponsoring this video. Check out the first link in the description below for more information. For this build, we're going to need a Toothpick 3 frame, a flight controller, propellers, motors, a VTX, a receiver, a camera mount, and of course, an FPV cycle sticker. You will also need a soldering iron, some 60-40 solder and some soldering flux, a side cutters, a needle nose pliers, a 1.5mm hex driver, a knife, a tweezers, a spudger, a lighter, some zip ties, and some assorted heat shrinks. To assemble the frame, we first need to open the bag. We can dump out all the bags inside the big bag. And I love how all this stuff is in individually shrunken or sealed compartments so that it's all organized. So first of all, we can cut out 4 of the arms. We don't need the 5th one. That's an extra. We're going to need the top and bottom plates. And we're also going to need these short screws at the very end. Before we start assembling the frame, I'm going to take some heat shrink that's just a bit bigger than the arms and cut it to around a 1/2 inch or 25mm in length. I'm going to cut 4 pieces of that, 1 for each arm. And then slip that over the arms. That's going to be to go around the motor wires to keep everything nice and tidy. Now that we have heat shrink on all our arms, we can take our bottom plate, making sure that the countersink is on the top, and insert the screws into the holes. Then holding the screws, we can flip it over, set it on the bench, then take our arms, slide them right over the screws, then we can take our top plate, set it on top, and then pinch the whole assembly, and take our 1.5mm hex driver, tighten everything up. Now we can grab our bag of hardware, and we're going to go for the shorter of the 2 sizes of stack screws. So I'm just going to cut this open here. We're also going to need the nuts, so I'm going to dump them out a while. The longer ones I'm just going to set aside. The shorter ones we can put up through the bottom, and then put the nuts on top. I'm going to grab my pliers to hold onto the nut. tighten that all the way down. Now we have our frame assembled. There's only one last thing to do, and that is to put the rubber band on that will hold the battery. We don't need the rest of those. So for this, just slip it over the one side, slip it over the other side, might need to use a spudger for this, or something to squash it in there. You're good to go. Okay, now that we're completely done assembling the frame, we can set that out of the way, turn on our soldering station, and grab our flight controller. First of all, we're going to attach the power wires and capacitor. If I can get it out of the bag here, there we go. So I'm just going to peel the cardboard off of the capacitor. Alright, now that I've got the cardboard peeled off, we're going to attach the XT30 connector. So I'm going to grab my soldering iron and some solder. And the way I like to do this is just fill up the XT30 connector with solder. So I just rest my soldering iron on it and then fill it up till the little hole thingy there is full of solder. Not overly full, just a nice amount like that. And there is a plus and minus on it, but the red wire always goes on the flat side. So I'm just going to heat the positive side up a bit and then shove the positive wire in there, like so. And the same for the negative wire. And you want to make sure that you don't move the wire around at all until the solder is hard, or else you'll get a cold solder joint and it could break while you're flying. Next, we're going to take our capacitor, push it on either side of the power wires, get it nice and lined up, and bend the wires together a bit on the other side so it stays put while we're soldering it. You want to make sure that the stripe on the capacitor is connected to the black wire. Otherwise, since this is an electrolytic capacitor, it could blow out on you when you plug it in. So now we can solder this fast. Just pile a blob of solder on there till it's nice and stuck. And then do the exact same thing on the other side. Alright, now that we got that soldered on, we can get some heat shrink. I think this is about 12 millimeters. We're going to cut a section that's just a bit longer than the capacitor and the connector. So about there. Finish the cut. This is really not the ideal tool for the job here, but then we can slide that over. Okay, now that we've got that done, we can solder it to the board. So I was not able to fit these wires in the holes. If you can fit them in the holes, that is ideal, but I was not able to. So I'm going to tin the pads. Alright, now that I've got the pads tinned, I can solder this fast. Like so. Okay, now that we've got all this attached, we can bring the frame back and the grommets. We're going to use these blue ones that are a little bit longer than the rest. There should be 4 of them, so I'm going to move them over here and get the rest out of the way. Preferably not on the floor, but now we've got our grommets. So I'm going to stick them in from the top of the flight controller. And these are quite tricky to get in, but if you can get one side of it in, and then sort of turn it and push it, usually goes through. So you stick one side in, kind of try and pull on the other side. As you turn it, this one is being a bugger. There we go. Almost there. There we go. Now we can stick this on the drone. So if you look on the bottom, you can see one side just has like a T on it, and the other side has this weird like square in the middle, and then kind of a X of sorts. So that shape is the front. The next step is to mount the motors. Each one comes with a bag of screws. And 3 different lengths. The short and medium ones are for mounting the motors to the frame, and the long ones are for T-mounting the propellers. With the thickness of frame we have, we're going to be using the short screws. This step is pretty easy. It doesn't matter which arm the motor goes on. Just line the holes up. Make sure the wires are going towards the middle of the frame. And use your 1.5mm hex driver. There we go. First motor done. When mounting the motors, you want to choose screws that just barely come through the motor mount. You do not want them to go into the windings, or they can short out the windings and damage the motor. The next step is to feed the wires through the heat shrink, which I realized after I put the motors on it would have been easier to do it as I was putting the motors on.
You want to go back to me?
No, I don't think so. Now that we have our wires through the heat shrinks, we can solder them fast to the flight controller. So for ultimate cleanness in our build, I'm going to route the wires around inside the frame like this. So to determine length, I'm going to take one wire and get it to just how I like it, so something like that, and then snip it off. Now I can cut all the other wires to the same length. routing our wires like this will also give us a little extra wire in case we mess up our soldering. To strip them, I'm just going to pinch them with my fingernail and yank the coating off. That one got a little bit long, so I'm going to trim some of it off. Now we can twist the ends of the wire a little bit so they don't fray while we're trying to solder them. Now we can tin the wires. It's better to not do it right over the flight controller in case you drop a blob of solder. Just enough that there's solder all through the wire, but not too much that it's a blob of solder on the end. Now we can tin the pads on our flight controller. And route the wires. I'm only going to put one in at a time so I don't have too much competition while I'm trying to solder. I'm going to get my plastic spudger, I'm not sure how you say it, but I'm going to use it. First one's done. One more to go for this motor. Helps to pull the flight controller down as far as it can go so that you have a little more space to work with. And I'm going to trim any that's sticking out. There we go. And that is going to look amazing. Now we just have 3 more motors to do. So same process, I'm going to take one wire, route it how I want it, and cut it off. And then cut the other 2 wires to the same length. Now we can strip them, twist the ends of the wires, tin the wires and the pads, and solder each wire in. And now we can trim off the extra wire. And there, the second motor is done. If this is your first build, I would not necessarily recommend doing the wire routing the same way I did, just because it's rather tricky to get everything soldered. I would probably just leave a little bit of slack in the wires and then solder them on like that on the top. because that is going to be much easier to solder. Just a trick to twist these wires, I like to pinch the wire, or the strands, and then actually twist the wire. Just a little easier than trying to twist the strands.
Sink.
Now we can trim the last 3 wires off. And we are done with the, well, soldering the motors on anyway. Alright, we got our motor wires soldered on. Now we can shrink our heat shrinks and make it look nice and pretty. For the front ones, I'm going to make sure that I have a little bit of space here for a zip tie because of how we're going to mount our antennas. So I'm going to keep them a little closer to the motor than the back ones. Alright, we have the arm heat shrinks done. Now we can move on to the receiver and VTX. Alright, we're done wiring up our motors. Now it's time to move on to the VTX and camera. For this build, we're using the Panda RC 16x16 25 to 400 milliwatt VTX. Maybe. There we go. Since we don't have any 16x16 mounting on this frame, I'm going to take the side cutters, which is in the other room. Just snip these corners off. And now we can take some of our large heat shrink. This is about 12 or 13 millimeters. And cut a piece that'll just nicely cover it. About like that. We can set that aside for later. Now we can get the included wires. Looks like they are already tinned, but it is probably lead-free solder. So I'm just going to tin them quick with some non-lead-free solder. Alright, now we can see on our card here that the leftmost one is video, so I'm going to take the yellow wire, stick it in from the bottom, and solder that fast. Doesn't take much solder for these tiny little wires. Alright, the next one is our white wire for smart audio. So I'm going to pop that in the hole. Solder that on. Just like that. Then we have our ground wire. And our power wire. Which is not going to go in very easily because I accidentally put solder on that pad already. There we go. Alright, now we have our wires soldered on. We can grab our antenna, put it on so that the antenna is sticking out in the same direction as the wires. Now we can take our heat shrink, cut it down so that it's just a little bit shorter than the VTX. That should work. Now, we can snip this corner out a little bit so that we still have access to the button once the heat shrink has been shrunk. And we can shrink the heat shrink. Now we can let that cool.
A few moments later.
Alright, this is cool. Now we can solder it fast to the drone. So, if this is the front of the drone, we're going to put it on just like this. We're going to attach the black wire to the ground pad on the front of the flight controller. So this is the front of the drone. So it's the second pad from the front. Right here, so I'm going to leave myself a little bit of slack and trim it off right about there. Now I can strip that wire with my fingernail. Now we can tin that wire. We can stick it in the hole on the flight controller. Whoops. And solder it fast. Alright, there's the first wire done. Now we can take the red wire, skip a pad, and then attach it to the next one. So I'm going to cut it off right about there. Strip it with the same method I used for the last one. Can tin this wire. Try to get that gunka stuff off the tip of my soldering iron. We can stick that in the 5-volt pad on the flight controller. Maybe. Sometimes if they don't go in, you can squeeze them just a bit with the pliers. Alright, I finally got that one to go in there. So we can solder that one fast. Like that. So the white wire is next. Goes to TX2. So I'm going to cut that one off right there. And I can strip it. Twist it. Alright, got one last wire for the VTX. And that goes to the V out. So I'm going to cut it right about there. And I can tin it. can solder it fast. Alright, VTX is done. Now we can solder the camera on. I'm not sure what camera this is, but there's a link in the description. This is from FPV Cycle. And these wires are about the right length, so I'm just going to leave them as they are. So the red wire goes on the first pad. Can solder that fast. There we go. Next wire is ground. I'm not going to put this one through the hole, I'm just going to solder it to the pad because I filled the hole with solder already by accident. Then the yellow wire can go on the V-in pad. We can solder that fast. And there we go. Alright, we're ready to install the receiver. So I'm going to grab the silicon wires from our VTX, and we're going to use these to connect the receiver to the flight controller. I'm going to grab the black wire, strip it, twist it, tin it. Hey, there we go. Then I'm going to insert it from the bottom into the hole and solder that fast. There we go. Now I'm going to grab the red wire, do the same thing. Alright, we're done. Now we can trim the excess off. This is looking nice and pretty. And we can bring our drone back. And this is going to go in just like this. So the ground is the first pad after your motor pads. So I'm going to leave a little bit of slack just in case I mess up. I'm going to cut it right about there. Now I can strip it and tin it. Of course, tin the pad. And these I'm just going to solder on top. I'm not going to try and stick them through, so I'm not too worried about them pulling off. It's going to go underneath the other two, and I can hold that on and solder it fast, just like that. The red wire's next. Pad just after it. So I'm going to cut it off somewhere around there. Like that. Just gonna snip it. Twist it. Tin it. Oh, tin the pad. And solder it fast. Alright, now we just have our signal wire left, so we're going to jump over a pad. Leave a little bit of slack and cut it about there. Same procedure as on all the other wires. Can solder that fast. Wow, that was horrible. Alright, all the soldering is done. I can turn off the soldering iron. The next thing to do is heat shrink the receiver. So I'm going to cut a piece of 10mm heat shrink, just a little bit longer than the whole thing. About like that. Should work. The next thing to do is heat shrink the receiver. So I'm going to grab some 10mm heat shrink, cut it a little bit longer than the whole thing. About there. Can snip that off. I'm going to feed it over the antennas. Maybe that's a little too long, so I'm going to trim about that much off. There we go, that looks good. So now I can heat shrink it. Try not to light anything on fire. Okay, that should be good. I'm gonna let that cool. Right, so the receiver heat shrink has now cooled. So I'm going to tuck it under the VTX. Make sure it's pointing forward. I'm going to make sure the camera is coming back. I'm going to leave the wires over the VTX. Make sure it's coming back behind this standoff. Now we can stick the canopy on. Push it all the way down to the grommets. And that's what holds the whole stack together. It's not going anywhere. Now we can take the lens cap off our camera and slip it in the camera mount so that the wires are at the bottom. It should clip nicely in there with a little bit of pressure. Just like that. Now we can clip our antenna in this nice little clippy thing on the canopy. And we're almost done. The last thing to do is put some zip ties on the arms to mount the antennas, because we don't want them just dangling here in the front. That looks ugly. So I'm going to stick the antenna, what am I saying? I'm going to stick the zip tie under the motor wires from the back to front. And then I'm going to loop it down around the arm and click it in so that it's pointed straight back. Well, not straight back, at an angle, but you get what my point. Gotta make that tight as you can. Should do. Just like that. Now we can route our antenna like this. and cut the zip tie off. I don't know, maybe like that. Be very careful not to cut the element. This white part of the antenna. The only part of the antenna that actually sends and receives signal is this little white part here. So all the black part is just shielding. It's just coaxial shielding. The white part is the only part that actually receives any data. So you want to make sure that's protected. It's not bent. It's not chopped off. And you want to keep it straight as possible. So now that I have this nicely routed, I'm happy with that. Gonna grab some fairly small heat shrink. This is about 3 or 4 millimeters, somewhere in there. Gonna put that over the whole thing. And then just pinch it where I want the end to be. And I can cut that off. And we can shrink the whole thing together. Just like that.
Looks cool.
Alright, there's the first one done. That's kind of flimsy while it's warm. But now we can do the other one. So same deal, put the zip tie in from the back towards the front. And then zip it shut. Round the arm nice and tight. Make sure you don't get any motor wires caught in there. We could have a problem. That'd be a good idea. That should be good enough. Alright, now we can determine the length of our zip tie. About like that. Again, be very careful not to cut the white part of the antenna. Now we can size our heat shrink. I'm just gonna do it like this. I'm not gonna actually slide it over yet. Now we can slide the heat shrink over the whole thing and shrink it shut. The next thing to do is set up a model in the transmitter and get it bound to the drone.
Welcome to OpenTX.
So I'm going to go into the model select, press and hold again, create a model. Yes, it does have a motor. 2 is fine, it does not have flaps. Yeah, it's all good. Yes, all is well. And return to exit. Now I can exit out of there. Now I'm going to go into model. And I'm going to rename it to something decent. Now I'm going to go backwards to get to the bottom. Turn my internal RF on. And then go to FR Sky, D16. And then go here to bind. Now I'm going to hold down the button on the receiver as I plug it in. So right here should be the bind button. So you just push that down till you can feel it click. And then plug it in, and then come over here, click on bind. Then when that stops, you can unplug it and plug it back in again. And it should be bound. I'm not going to go over how to set up inputs on your transmitter for arming, turtle mode, and such, because Joshua Bardwell already has a really good video explaining how to do all that. Alright, we are almost done. But before we put the propellers on, let's take it over to the computer and get Betaflight set up. Now we can hop into Betaflight. Make sure your drone is plugged in to the computer with a micro USB cable, and you have a battery plugged in. Now we can tick the box that says the propellers are off. And check to make sure all the motors are spinning in the correct direction. For me, motor 1 was spinning in the opposite direction that it was supposed to be spinning in, so I'm going to correct that in just a moment. Now we can jump into BL Heli Configurator and fix the motor that was spinning the wrong direction. So you can connect and then read setup. And then I'm going to the first motor and selecting reversed. Then flash all. Select the official version and flash. Then it'll flash all the ESCs, which will take a few minutes. Now we are done in BL Heli Configurator. So we can close that and hop back into Betaflight. Go to configuration, enable motor direction is reversed. And change the craft name to whatever you like. I usually just get rid of it because I don't show it on my OSD. Then the motor arm angle needs to go to 180, otherwise if you're stuck in a tree upside down, you won't be able to arm to try and get out. And this number needs to be 0. I missed that going through this the first time. The rest is fine, so I'm going to go over to the receiver tab and just make sure all my sticks are doing the correct thing. Now we can head into the modes tab, and I'm going to just set up some arming, angle, beeper, and flip over after crash. Now we can go set up the OSD pretty much however you want. It doesn't really matter, just make sure you have warnings enabled. The last thing to do is set up all the PIDs. You need to make sure you have everything set up just like this. And I will paste it in the description as well. that's it. We're done. Now we can disconnect and put the props on. We are almost done. We finished building it, we finished software setup, now we just need to put propellers on and fly it. Since we are running props out, that means the propellers are going to be spinning like this. So for this motor, the propeller is going to have the leading edge on this side. So it's going to be spinning this way. And for this one, it's going to have the leading edge or higher side of the propeller on this side. So, like, yeah. Alright, we've got all our propellers on. Now to put the battery in here, just grab this rubber band, slip the battery in. And then spread it out a little bit so it's nice and secure. Now we're ready to go fly. We had a few issues that you just saw. The board was rotated 90 degrees in Betaflight, so it was just like flipping out after you tried to take off. So we got it fixed, and we're ready for the maiden. Alright, this thing is awesome. I don't think I even got over half throttle. So that's going to wrap up this video. See you in the next one.
Thank you to Enine for sponsoring this video, but I'm sorry that we won't use subtitles.